I had never really paid much attention to the little annoyances that came with living in a suburban community until I moved into this particular neighborhood. It was one of those places where every house was painted almost the same shade of beige or gray, manicured lawns stretched meticulously in every direction, and the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and chlorine from the nearby community pool. At first, I thought it would be a dream come true, a quiet area, friendly neighbors, and a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. But the truth about this place revealed itself slowly, in the tiniest details, like how the wind would ruffle the leaves on the trees just enough to make them scratch against the windows, or how the streetlights would flicker for a split second at precisely 2:14 a.m. each night. I had moved here seeking solace from the chaos of city life, the constant honking of horns, and the suffocating energy of crowded streets. I wanted something predictable, controlled, something that promised stability. And, on the surface, that's exactly what this place delivered. That was until I discovered the real face of the Homeowners Association, a faceless, bureaucratic entity that prided itself on policing every minor detail of its residents' lives. The first time I really felt the tension was on a Wednesday morning. I had rolled my trash can out the night before, just like any responsible homeowner, lined it up neatly at the curb, and gone about my business. I didn't think much of it, except maybe to glance outside later and see the garbage trucks making their rounds. But when I stepped outside the following morning, still groggy from waking up before sunrise, I noticed my trash can had been knocked over. Not tipped slightly, not even pushed to the side, but completely overturned, its contents spilling onto the pavement in a messy, chaotic heap. I was momentarily irritated, sure, but I rationalized it. Maybe the garbage truck driver had misjudged his turn, maybe the wind had done it, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog was responsible. I set the can upright, cleaned up the debris, and assumed it was a one-time occurrence. By the end of the week, though, it had become a pattern. Every morning I woke up, I found my trash can either toppled over or moved to a completely different spot, sometimes even rotated so that the wheels faced the wrong way. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor with a mischievous streak, someone who got their kicks from creating minor chaos. But as the days went by, the frequency of these incidents escalated. One evening, as I returned from work, I saw a figure standing near my driveway, casually adjusting the lid of my trash can and glancing around as if checking to see whether I had noticed. My heart raced. It wasn't a prank anymore, it was targeted. And then it hit me, the HOA had taken a personal interest in me. I didn't know their reasoning yet, but the implication was clear. They were monitoring, judging, and manipulating my day-to-day existence over something as trivial as a trash can. The absurdity of it didn't lessen my anger. It wasn't just about the garbage, it was about the principle, about control. These people had uniforms of authority, or at least the illusion of it, and they wielded their influence like a weapon. I started observing patterns, times when the can would be disturbed, the subtle footprints on my lawn leading up to the sidewalk, the faint scratches on the curb where the wheels of my bin had been dragged. I documented everything, like a meticulous detective preparing for a case I didn't yet know the scope of. The HOA had become a silent adversary, hiding behind rules, covenants, and petty enforcement measures, but I wasn't about to let them bully me. I began to plot quietly, letting my frustration simmer and my mind churn over the possibilities. How do you confront an entity that seems invisible, omnipresent, and indifferent to common decency? That was the question I asked myself each night, scribbling notes, sketching diagrams, imagining traps and contraptions, each more elaborate than the last. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern persisted. My trash can was no longer just an object, it had become a symbol of resistance, a canvas for rebellion. Every time it was tipped over, I felt a surge of defiance building inside me. I started envisioning a solution, something no one had anticipated, a creation so simple yet so cunning that the HOA's relentless interference would meet its match. I thought about the mechanics of leverage, the angle of tipping, the weight distribution, and the materials that would endure both the elements and the occasional intrusive hand. I imagined the smug looks of the HOA enforcers the next time they tried to assert their authority, their expressions frozen in shock as they realized that I had outsmarted them. It wasn't just revenge, it was a statement, a reclamation of the small freedoms we all take for granted. And in those quiet nights, with the streetlights casting long shadows across my yard, I resolved that I would build the one thing they never saw coming, the ultimate countermeasure to their petty tyranny. The moment I decided to fight back, everything about my daily routine shifted. My evenings, once filled with mindless television or scrolling on my phone, became quiet workshops of planning and problem-solving. In my garage, under the harsh glow of a single hanging bulb, I started laying out tools and sketching designs on an old drafting pad I'd kept from my college days. It felt almost nostalgic, like slipping back into a version of myself I hadn't seen in years, the one who built things, who created with his hands instead of consuming with his eyes. I was going to turn a trash can into something far more than the HOA could imagine, and the process of doing it became as satisfying as the revenge itself. I started by thinking about what exactly I wanted to achieve. This couldn't just be a deterrent, some pathetic little lock or sticker meant to scare off whoever was tampering with my property. No, this had to be a trap disguised as normalcy, an unassuming object that punished interference while remaining perfectly functional for me. I remembered watching old documentaries about animal traps when I was a kid, fascinated by how they combined simplicity with inevitability. Step here, trigger there, and before the animal even knew what was happening, it was caught. That was the inspiration. I wanted the HOA enforcers, these self-styled cops, to think they were just tipping over another can when, in reality, they were setting off something they couldn't predict. First came the structure. I bought a new trash can, a large industrial model that dwarfed the cheap plastic bins the HOA provided. It was heavy, reinforced, and had a lid that sealed with a rubber gasket. From the outside, it looked like any other high-end trash container, but inside I began to build a framework of aluminum and steel rods, the skeleton of my device. Every cut and measurement was precise. I worked in silence, only the occasional squeal of a drill bit or the hiss of a soldering iron breaking the stillness of the night. I reinforced the base with hidden weights, making it impossible to tip with one hand. But that wasn't enough. I wanted it to respond to interference, not just resist it. That's when I started experimenting with pressure triggers. I ordered a set of industrial-grade pressure sensors online, the kind you'd normally see in warehouse equipment or high-security doors. I wired them to a small circuit board that I could program myself. It had been years since I'd coded anything beyond a quick Excel macro, but the knowledge came back fast. The sensors would detect sudden tilting or force and, when triggered, would release a series of responses. The first idea I had was simple, a piercing alarm that would go off the moment someone tried to knock it over. But that felt too obvious, too easy for them to shrug off. So I escalated. I designed the interior of the can to hold a set of die packs, similar to the ones used in banks. With a small jolt of electricity from the pressure sensor, the packs would explode with a burst of bright, harmless, but impossible to remove ink. Anyone tampering with my trash can would walk away looking like they'd lost a fight with a paint factory. The image alone brought a grin to my face. But even that didn't feel like enough. I wanted more. Not cruelty, not harm, just an unforgettable consequence, something that would make them think twice before ever crossing my property line again. I began integrating a motion-activated camera disguised as part of the handle. It would record everything in high definition, time-stamped and automatically uploaded to a cloud storage account I'd set up under a dummy name. This way, even if they figured out the trick and tried to destroy the evidence, their faces would already be stored in multiple backups. No HOA fine, no empty apology letter would save them from the embarrassment of being caught red-handed. Night after night, my garage became a laboratory of retribution. Tools cluttered every surface, pliers, wires, cans of industrial adhesive. Blueprints and schematics hung on the walls like war maps, lines and arrows connecting ideas, revisions marked in red ink. The longer I worked, the more focused I became. It wasn't just about the trash can anymore. It was about reclaiming control, about proving to myself that I wasn't powerless. I was tired of being passive, tired of accepting their petty abuses because it was easier than confrontation. By the time 2 weeks had passed, I had built something unlike anything I'd ever seen. The can was a fortress, a trap, and a surveillance system all rolled into one. From the curb, it looked perfectly normal, even boring. That was its genius. To an unsuspecting HOA cop, it was just another trash can waiting to be tipped. But to me, it was the culmination of hours of work, a hidden snare designed to deliver justice in a way no letter or lawsuit ever could. Yet even as I admired my creation, I knew I had to be careful. I had to think 3 steps ahead. What if they retaliated? What if they called the real police? What if my plan backfired and I ended up looking like the villain in my own story? These thoughts kept me awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of my refrigerator downstairs. But each time doubt crept in, I remembered the mornings I'd spent cleaning garbage off the sidewalk, the smirk of the man I'd seen standing near my driveway, the hypocrisy of people who hid behind rules to justify harassment. That memory was my fuel. I began rehearsing the moment in my head. I'd roll the can out as usual, just like I did every week. I'd place it at the curb, lid closed, wheels facing the street, nothing out of the ordinary. And then I'd wait. I wouldn't watch from the window like some nervous child. No, I'd let the camera do its job. I'd let them think they'd won again, that they'd gotten the best of me. And then, when the die exploded, when the alarm shrieked, when their faces lit up on my phone screen, I'd know that my patience had paid off. The anticipation became a living thing. Each day I grew more eager, more restless. It was like preparing for a performance, every detail rehearsed, every cue timed. I'd never built anything like this before, not even in my engineering classes back in college. This wasn't just a project. It was an act of artistry, an act of war, an act of reclaiming my dignity. I could already imagine the look on their faces, their eyes wide, their mouths open, their hands covered in indelible ink. The thought alone was enough to keep me working into the small hours, tightening screws, testing sensors, calibrating triggers until everything was perfect. And when it was, I stood back and looked at my creation one last time. Under the dim light of the garage, it looked like any other trash can. But I knew better. I knew what lay inside, what it was capable of, what it represented. It wasn't just a bin. It was my statement to the HOA, my defiance made tangible. The next time they tried to assert their petty authority, they wouldn't just be tipping over trash, they'd be triggering the end of their little game. The morning I decided to set the trap, I felt a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and an almost guilty thrill. I treated it like preparing for a battle. I woke up earlier than usual, showered, and dressed in casual clothes, the kind that made me blend in with the neighborhood, as if I were just another homeowner taking out the trash. Nothing about me would hint at the device I had created. I rolled the reinforced bin to the curb just as I had practiced for weeks. Its lid was closed, the wheels aligned perfectly with the street, and the camera hidden neatly in the handle. I stepped back and took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline surge through my veins. The air was crisp, the sun rising over the manicured lawns of my suburban battlefield. Every shadow on the street seemed amplified, every distant sound, the barking of a dog, the chirp of a bird, the rustle of a newspaper in a neighbor's driveway, felt like part of the suspenseful soundtrack to my plan. For the next hour, I watched discreetly from behind the sheer curtains of my living room. The neighborhood was waking up. Mail carriers moved from house to house, joggers ran past, and the occasional neighbor waved at me, blissfully unaware of the drama that was about to unfold on their quiet street. Then, around mid-morning, I saw them, the HOA cops. Two men, wearing the official-looking polo shirts and khakis that identified them as the enforcers of the association, strolled down the sidewalk, clipboards in hand. They were the same men I had glimpsed several times before, the ones who seemed to take personal pride in knocking over my trash can. I could feel my pulse quicken as they approached, their expressions a mixture of smugness and casual authority, completely unaware of the device lying in wait. I could almost hear the mocking tone in their thoughts, "Here we go again with this guy." They reached the can and paused. I held my breath, eyes narrowing as one of them bent down, fingers brushing the lid, testing its resistance. The other leaned on the handle, giving it a little push, likely expecting it to topple easily. And then it happened. The sensors I had so carefully calibrated detected the tilt, and the first stage of the mechanism activated. A sharp, piercing alarm screamed out of the can, loud enough to startle birds into the air and catch the attention of the entire street. The men jumped back, eyes wide, hands flailing instinctively to cover their ears. But the moment was just beginning. As they recoiled, the dye packs released, and brilliant streaks of indelible ink sprayed across their shirts, their pants, and their hands. The shock on their faces was priceless, a mixture of disbelief, horror, and the faint realization that they had just walked into a trap they had no idea existed. I couldn't help but laugh. I laughed so hard that my sides ached, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the pure satisfaction of justice. From the living room, the motion-activated camera had already begun recording, capturing every reaction in high definition. Their attempts to clean themselves were futile. The ink was designed to cling, to stain, to humiliate. And humiliate it did. Neighbors began to peek through their windows, drawn by the alarm, their expressions moving from curiosity to outright amusement as they witnessed the enforcers of the HOA looking ridiculous and disheveled. I imagined the conversations that would follow, the whispered gossip at the next association meeting, and the quiet satisfaction that I, the so-called victim, had turned the tables in the most spectacular way imaginable. The two men scrambled to regain control, frantically trying to right the can and stop the alarm, but it was no use. Every action they took only triggered additional responses I had designed. The more they struggled, the more chaotic the scene became, and the more I realized how perfectly my plan had worked. The dye had splattered onto their clipboards, onto the shoes of the man nearest to the curb, and onto the grass in front of my house. It was a mess, a carefully orchestrated masterpiece of poetic justice. Even as they yelled and waved their arms, the camera recorded it all, the footage automatically backing up to my cloud storage. Every move, every expression, every frantic gesture was immortalized digitally, proof that they had attempted harassment and failed spectacularly. I stepped outside casually a few minutes later, as if nothing had happened, holding a coffee cup in one hand and letting the other rest in my pocket. The men froze when they saw me, their faces painted with shock, frustration, and a begrudging recognition of defeat. I smiled politely, nodded, and said, "Good morning," letting the absurdity of the moment hang between us. They stammered, glanced at the mess, then back at me, trying to regain composure, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. They had underestimated me. They had assumed compliance, passivity, and weakness. Instead, I had delivered a response that was clever, non-violent, and utterly humiliating, all at once. The street began to fill with whispers and pointing fingers as neighbors emerged to see the spectacle. Children giggled from their bicycles, elderly couples shook their heads in disbelief, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked repeatedly, as though applauding the drama. The HOA men muttered to each other, attempting to salvage what little dignity they could, but the damage was done. Their authority had been publicly undermined, and I had captured every second of it for posterity. I felt a rush of empowerment I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about reclaiming my space, asserting my right to live free from petty intimidation, and proving that ingenuity and patience could topple even the most entrenched systems of control. As the dust, or rather, the ink, settled, I realized something important. This was only the beginning. The HOA would be talking, plotting, and trying to figure out how I had managed to outsmart them. But by then, it wouldn't matter. I had already won. The trash can had done its job perfectly, and the world, or at least my street, had witnessed it. I stepped back onto my porch, sipping my coffee, letting the early morning sun warm my face. For the first time since moving here, I felt a sense of complete control, a sense that I could defend my home and my dignity without resorting to aggression or lawfare. I had created something brilliant, something invisible yet unstoppable, and in doing so, I had finally tipped the scales in my favor. The days following the incident were surreal, like living in a world that had shifted slightly but irreversibly. The neighborhood had changed its rhythm, conversations at fences and in driveways carried a different undertone. People walked past my house with subtle smiles or knowing nods, and even strangers passing through the street seemed to sense that something unusual had happened here. I watched it all from the comfort of my porch, savoring the quiet triumph that came from being underestimated and then delivering a response that was both clever and undeniably satisfying. The HOA enforcers, the men who had once taken personal delight in disturbing my peace, had been transformed into cautionary figures. Their aura of authority had been punctured, their self-assurance replaced with hesitation and embarrassment. Every time I saw them on their rounds, they avoided direct eye contact, muttered awkward greetings, and glanced nervously toward my driveway, as if expecting the trash can to leap out and humiliate them again. It wasn't just the psychological satisfaction that thrilled me, it was the complete dismantling of the power dynamic they had tried to enforce. For years, the HOA had operated like a silent, omnipresent force, policing lawns, trash cans, and the minutiae of suburban life. They thrived on compliance, on the fear that people like me would silently endure petty indignities rather than challenge them. But I had shown that patience, ingenuity, and careful planning could completely invert that dynamic. Suddenly, their rules felt brittle, their sense of control tenuous. In the days that followed, I noticed fewer complaints, fewer inspections, and a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the way the neighborhood conducted itself. My yard, once a battleground, became a symbol of resilience. It was a quiet victory, but a profound one, the kind that rippled outward in ways that weren't immediately visible but were deeply felt. The HOA tried to respond, of course. There were polite letters in my mailbox, thinly veiled threats about property maintenance violations and community guidelines. I read them carefully, smiling at the predictable formalities and the utterly ineffectual language. Their words were powerless now, the tape had been ripped from their hands, their authority deflated by a simple, well-executed act of ingenuity. I didn't ignore the letters entirely, I kept them, documenting everything, adding them to a growing folder of evidence that could prove the extent of their harassment had reached a farcical level. It was almost enjoyable, cataloging their attempts at intimidation, knowing that the trap I had set had already neutralized any power they hoped to wield. Their credibility in the neighborhood had subtly eroded, and I could sense that even those who hadn't directly witnessed the incident had heard whispers, seen the aftermath, and reconsidered just how much deference was appropriate when dealing with them. Neighbors began approaching me with small, conspiratorial smiles. I heard what happened, one woman said as she watered her front garden, carefully avoiding eye contact with the HOA patrols down the street. Another, an older gentleman walking his dog, nodded approvingly when I waved. I could feel a sense of shared amusement, even admiration. The neighborhood, which had once felt like a carefully controlled stage where rules were enforced with precision and judgment, now seemed infused with a subtle air of rebellion. People moved with a little more confidence, tended their yards a little less rigidly, and glanced at the trash cans on the curbs with a new curiosity, perhaps wondering what I had done differently. I had sparked something small but meaningful, a sense that compliance was optional, that ingenuity could circumvent even the most petty forms of control, and that standing up for oneself didn't have to be loud or violent, it could be smart, quiet, and devastatingly effective. As for the HOA men themselves, their routines began to crumble. They tiptoed down the streets as if expecting to trigger some hidden mechanism, avoiding homes where residents had ever made eye contact with me, skipping my driveway entirely. The humor of the situation wasn't lost on me. The very people who had taken joy in asserting dominance now feared my property and, by extension, me. Their whispers, the hurried notes to each other, the nervous glances over shoulders, it was the beginning of a subtle unraveling. I even caught glimpses of them pacing in their own offices, likely trying to figure out how I had engineered a trash can that was simultaneously normal, innocuous, and terrifying to meddle with. It was poetic justice. I imagined their conversation in those meetings. How did he? That's impossible. Their confusion only added to the satisfaction of the entire affair. But the real victory wasn't just about humiliation or the thrill of revenge, it was about reclaiming my personal space and my peace of mind. For the first time since moving to this neighborhood, I felt in control of my environment. I could leave my driveway without worrying about petty sabotage. I could walk past the curb without bracing myself for some absurd intrusion into my life. The trash can, once a symbol of frustration and helplessness, had been transformed into an emblem of empowerment. And in the quiet evenings, as I sat on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops and the shadows stretch across the perfectly maintained lawns, I understood something profound. Power isn't always about authority, rules, or force. Sometimes, it's about patience, cleverness, and the willingness to act when others underestimate you. In that simple act of creating the one trash can they never saw coming, I had achieved more than just revenge. I had restored a sense of dignity and control that no petty enforcer could ever take away. Even as weeks passed, the story of the incident spread quietly, becoming part of neighborhood lore. People referenced it with humor, shaking their heads in disbelief at the audacity of both the HOA men and my response. It was the kind of tale that would be retold with a smile, a subtle cautionary lesson to anyone tempted to misuse authority. And every time I walked past my reinforced, inconspicuous trash can, I felt that same surge of satisfaction, that silent acknowledgement that I had played the game on my terms and won. It was a small victory, perhaps, but one that carried profound implications, proof that ingenuity, preparation, and courage could topple even the most irritating and seemingly untouchable systems of control. I had built something beyond a trap. I had built respect, fear, and, above all, freedom, all in one cleverly disguised bin. In the weeks and months that followed, life returned to a sense of normalcy, though normal, in my neighborhood now carried a different flavor. There was a subtle shift in energy, an unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of power had changed. The HOA men no longer strutted down the sidewalks with the smug confidence they had once carried. Their authority had been quietly dismantled. I would occasionally see them walking past my property, hands tucked nervously in their pockets, eyes darting toward my driveway as if expecting another surprise. Even when they smiled politely at me, there was a faint tension in their posture, a recognition that the man they had underestimated had proven to be more clever, patient, and resourceful than they ever imagined. I, on the other hand, walked freely, head held high, confident in my ability to reclaim not just my property but my peace of mind. I felt a deep satisfaction in the quiet victory I had engineered, and a subtle pride in having done so without confrontation, without violence, and without losing my sense of humor. The reinforced trash can had become more than just a device of revenge. It had evolved into a symbol of ingenuity and personal empowerment. I maintained it meticulously, testing sensors occasionally, checking the integrity of the die packs, ensuring the hidden camera continued to function, all under the guise of a perfectly ordinary household chore. It was my silent sentinel, a guardian of my property and dignity. Neighbors would sometimes comment on how solid and modern the can looked, completely oblivious to the mechanism within, and I would smile quietly, knowing the truth. It had become a legend in its own small way, a story that others would recount with awe or amusement whenever the HOA's petty overreach came up in conversation. I found myself relishing the subtle prestige of being the man who had bested the system, who had turned an everyday annoyance into a tale of triumph. What struck me most, however, wasn't just the embarrassment I had inflicted on the HOA enforcers, it was the clarity it gave me about my own capabilities. For too long, I had tolerated minor indignities, assuming that compliance was easier than confrontation. I had underestimated my own resourcefulness, my ability to think creatively, and my capacity for patience and planning. By taking control of the situation, by turning frustration into a carefully executed plan, I discovered a level of personal confidence that extended far beyond the boundaries of my driveway. I became more attentive in other aspects of my life, more proactive, more observant, more willing to challenge minor injustices before they escalated. The trash can incident became a turning point, a quiet awakening to the power of strategy, intelligence, and timing in navigating the often absurd world of bureaucracy and petty authority. The HOA, in the months after, gradually receded into a quieter, less invasive force. Complaints against me stopped entirely. Other residents seemed to have adopted a more measured approach to minor infractions, likely influenced by the story of my clever countermeasure. It was as if the invisible rules that had once dominated the neighborhood had been softened, tempered by the example of what happens when one person refuses to be bullied. And while some still feared confrontation with the association, most seemed to respect the idea that ingenuity and preparedness could level the playing field. The neighborhood dynamic shifted subtly but permanently, the invisible power of the HOA no longer absolute, its arbitrary enforcement now tempered by caution. It was a profound and satisfying change, one that reminded me that the smallest acts of cleverness could ripple outward in ways no one could anticipate. As I stood on my porch one quiet evening, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops and casting long shadows across the street, I realized something that went beyond revenge or satisfaction. I had transformed a minor frustration into an experience that redefined the boundaries of control, ingenuity, and personal pride. The trash can, once a symbol of petty harassment, had become an emblem of empowerment. The neighborhood had witnessed, directly or indirectly, the consequences of underestimating someone who refused to accept injustice quietly. And in the process, I had discovered something fundamental about myself, that patience, careful planning, and a willingness to act decisively could turn even the smallest object into an instrument of liberation. I smiled, sipped my coffee, and felt a profound sense of peace. I had built the one trash can they never saw coming, and in doing so, I had reclaimed not only my driveway but a quiet, enduring dignity that no rules, no petty enforcers, and no bureaucracy could ever take away. Life had returned to normal, but for me, normal would never be the same again. It was now defined by vigilance, ingenuity, and the sweet satisfaction of outsmarting those who sought to control me.